Good afternoon, everybody. That's the CloudEDU chicken welcoming to our bi-weekly webinar. I think we've had actually a couple more weeks off than that because our last one had some technical glitches. I will be reposting that as a plain old screencast as soon as I have a few free moments to re-record it. It was actually a lot of fun, and if you're trying to get to that blissful state of inbox zero, it will be one worth watching. But today our focus is on the Protection of Personal Information Act in South Africa. We have a lot of people who are very interested today, particularly school managers and IT professionals. And we have a fantastic guest today. I'm just going to be serving as your host. But a quick reminder that we're brought to you by CloudEDU. CloudEDU is your Google for Education partner in South Africa. We work with lots of schools across the country, throughout Southern Africa, and even into the African continent and beyond. We're actually doing a lot of work in Europe right now. We offer technical deployments, technical audits, which I know Aleister is going to refer to today, as well as professional development and training, both for your Google administrator and for your educators and other users in your organization. So if you haven't chatted to us about training and professional development, you can pop over to our website, or if I have a moment, I'll drop my email in the chat. In the meantime, I want to introduce Alister Payne. Alister is uniquely qualified to be presenting today because of his background, and I'm going to go ahead and let him do a short bio. I'll interrupt him if he goes on and on. But Alister, you want to do your 30-second version?
Sure. Firstly, a very warm welcome from Cape Town, and an emphasis on warm because I think unlike the rest of the country, Cape Town is enjoying some very warm, enjoyable weather at the moment. So my background is 20 years in education, working in schools, 17 years of that as an IT administrator, right back from sort of the early 90s involved in email, and 10 years in school management. My academic background is a little bit Anurakish and probably a little bit more relevant for the topic, and that is I did a master's degree in information systems, specifically looking at how children behave online. But as Kevin has said, a kind of a unique position, understanding schools, understanding management, understanding IT, but also understanding the risks that could be potentially and are in the market as we see playing out sort of in world news at the moment. So yeah, a wealth of experience, and in that a father to two daughters. So don't know where the instruction manual is. If anybody can help me find that, I'd be much appreciated.
Surely there's a webinar for that.
There must be. I haven't found it yet.
All right, so why don't we dive on in? First of all, I want to say we're not attorneys. Our focus is on the technical best practices for managing data in the Google environment. It's still early days for POPI implementation, and nobody really knows what the long-term ramifications will be. Everybody's job right now is to do the best we can with the knowledge that we have, and that includes both your service providers like us and schools. So this shouldn't be a high stress moment. It should be a high awareness moment, and that would be our general advice as we dive into this. So for those of you who might not be aware, Aleister, can you tell us what is POPI and why should we care?
Yeah, it's not a swear word, which some people think it is at the moment. Yeah, so a little bit of background about POPI. POPI was an act of parliament back in 2013. Believe it or not, you may have heard of GDPR as well, which is the General Data and Protection and Regulation Act, which was promulgated in Europe in about 2018. I think the 25th of May 2018. You may have got a slew of emails asking you to update your information. But POPI actually came out before the GDPR. Despite it being conceptualized or initialized before the GDPR actually came out and was promulgated before POPI itself. So the way some people describe it is POPI's kind of like a small brother to the larger GDPR. Before that in Europe, each and every single city was responsible for its own data protection laws. So GDPR basically made the data protection law all the standards across the whole of Europe. So POPI came in it was in 2013, and it basically promulgated or became an act in the middle of last year. And there was a year's grace period, and I think it's on the 1st of July this year, in which case the grace period has now completed. It draws a lot of experience, a lot of guidance from GDPR in many different ways. There are some differences. GDPR is about European citizens, where the POPI Act is about people in South Africa. The POPI also covers organization and organizational data, which the European one doesn't. At its heart, POPI has kind of like, don't think of it as a standard or an industry standard where you have to reach a bar. It's a minimum requirement, and there are 8 minimum requirements inside of POPI. So things like accountability, making sure that the data is used for the specific purpose that it was intended or collected. You've got to ensure the quality of the information, the openness of it. But the key one for us is the standard, the security safeguards that one needs to keep into place. And that's essentially the scope and the boundary of today's discussion is around the security safeguards, and in particular, its implications on Google Workspace. As Kevin said rightly, we're not lawyers. At the end of the day, we're not legal experts. We are educational, edtech, and technology experts, and we're going to see it through that lens. Often I get asked, why should we care about POPI? Is it really that necessary to care about it? Well, the answer, it's simple to answer that is yes. What POPI does is it takes the burden and responsibility, and it places on the protection of data, and it places it very squarely on the shoulders of the school or the business or the entity that's controlling that data.
And can a school, I'm just thinking of government schools, can a government school kind of push that onto a Department of Education, or is it still the individual government school's responsibility?
I think it's every entity's responsibility. I don't think that's something that you can push onto a department. I do believe that you would receive guidance from that department. I've seen an excellent document from ISASA. I don't think we referenced it in our resources, or I may have referenced it in our resources. We can add that. But the ISASA, the Independent Schools Association, sent out some documentation and some guidance, and I would expect the department to send out some guidance. But I don't believe that means that you now renege your responsibility in being able to take care of these things. It is going to be up to the individual schools and the management in that school to make sure that you are POPI compliant.
Okay. So the message, the takeaway is to regularly verify that you're POPI compliant and continually update that compliance or update your policies, make sure that you've got some kind of attention on it and could show that. Is that right?
Yeah, and we'll get into some of the more legally wording. Again, it's not a legal argument from our perspective, right, but we'll get into the kind of wording. But essentially, the way I kind of think of it, which my family get upset about sometimes, and I jokingly say to my nephews and nieces who are doing exams, I say to them, exams are just the high jump. You just have to make it over the minimum requirement. And of course, I normally get some evil looks at this point in time, and that's in jest. But in this case, it is a minimum requirement. That doesn't mean that you don't shoot for the best possible scenario. You absolutely do. But the principle of it is a minimum requirement.
And can a school be held liable for or responsible for a breach or misuse of data?
So the simple answer to that is yes. Of course, the school can be held liable for the misuse of the data. Now, when it comes to schools, it's probably fair to assume that schools are not going to misuse the data. I mean, just today, I've been sitting at my desk, and I've got Truecaller, which is an app running on my phone. And I think I've had like 3 or 4 different scam calls come through and be blocked by Truecaller. Those are companies misusing, fraudulently using information. I'm not sure if fraud is as strong a word as that, but they're certainly misusing the information at their fingertips to try and make sales. Schools aren't going to necessarily do that. They're using that for good reason. I mean, there may be some question marks around alumni and using the information for alumni. I mean, I was involved in a school where we built the alumni from the ground up. And the way we did it is we went to the school magazines back from year dot, got the kids' names, got the old databases that were on paper. Somebody inputted that into the database, and we used that to fundraise, as in build spirit within the school. But an element of it was fundraising as well. So I have a question mark on whether you are using that data that you got from parents for academic and administrative and financial reasons while they're at the school, then to use that for fundraising at a later date. I think there's a big question mark about that, but schools can certainly most certainly be held liable. I mean, the number that's being bandied around, what's in the provision of the law, is about 10 million rands worth of fine. Is a school really going to get that? I don't think so. I think, you know, the regulator would probably engage with that school first, and if there's a blatant misuse, then the fine is sitting there as a stick.
So I know we've got a lot of IT managers and Google administrators probably watching today. If I'm the IT person at the school and the school's made it my responsibility to enforce POPI, is that fair, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I mean, listen, you could potentially have somebody sitting out there this afternoon that is an IT person and also a manager at the school and is responsible for data compliance. That would be in the role that I would have played within my school environment. I was a deputy headmaster, I was in charge of administration, and I was the IT guy. So yes, that would have been the seat that I would have sat in. But I don't believe it's fair to take this entire responsibility around POPI and kind of drop that into the lap of the poor IT person. And there are ramifications to that IT person. So one of the elements of POPI is that you have to appoint a data officer. I think that's the wording that they use. You have to have a data officer appointed. That should be somebody within senior management in the school. They would obviously then rely on the IT person to check the boxes and make sure that you have, you know, identified your risks and all those things that go with it, and we'll get into some of those. But I don't believe it's fair just to kind of lump this in the IT person's position. And if you are in that position, I would you know, push that back up the line and say, I'm sorry, but you know, that's not a fair responsibility to hand to me.
Okay, so we keep talking about data, and I think the question is, what kinds of data should we be examining for risk specifically?
Okay, so this is something we as an organization have done some deep thinking in for. Kevin, I think you and I have done a lot of that for 6 to 8 months. And it hasn't been under the sort of umbrella of POPI. It's been under the umbrella of how do we organize our data and how do we be more structured, more efficient, and more effective. And then of late, it's been a little bit more around POPI and kind of how do we identify those risks. So the way that I see it is that there are 3 types of data, or 3 areas of risk that one needs to look at: authentication, communication, and documentation. I'm not sure if documentation is quite the right word, but I did like the IONs on the ends, so it kind of rolled off the tongue. So what do I mean by authentication? Essentially, how do users log onto the system? Some of you may have been to my workshop before. I've spoken about how Google is secure by design. I mean, a Googler can't even go into the data center if they're not meant to be in that data center. If they swipe their card, I think they get sort of fired immediately, or that's the urban myth more than anything else. But all your data is encrypted at rest and in transit. The place where it comes together is when you input a password. So your weakest link is your password. So within an organization, how people log on, are they logging on in a secure manner, are key critical questions that you need to ask. If you have a super administrator, somebody who has the keys to the kingdom of your Google Workspace environment, and their password is insecure, that would be a major red flag and a potential risk. Because somebody's a super administrator, they can delete all your mail, they can read any mail, they can control your documents, they can delete your entire domain. And part of the sort of the double-edged sword here is that Google themselves are making sure that they're compliant with all of these legal frameworks. And so when we ask somebody to delete data, they have to delete data. So if you ask Google to delete something, i.e. your entire domain, Google will delete it and they won't bring it back. So, you know, key questions around authentication are my super administrators and are my senior managers in my school doing things like implementing 2-factor authentication? You know, for us as a business, and I'll hold it up, you probably can't see it, we're busy implementing solo keys. So you've literally got to plug in a physical device and click the button if you want to log in. So that's part of it. how you provision users, sorry, is normally not an issue, but how you de-provision users becomes a key critical risk as well. You know, those staff that have been there for years and have left, are you making sure you remove them from resources that they shouldn't have access to? Can they still log into those accounts? So that's the first one, authentication. And it really is, I'd like to say one of these is more key than the other, and it's just not the case. These are sort of all equally important.
I'm going to interrupt you before you dive into communication, because I know where you're headed. We have a really good timely question. Person says they're enforcing two-factor authentication for members at the school, for staff members at the school. Would you recommend enforcing it for learners as well, or is that outside POPI concerns?
Yeah, so my very strong recommendation would be for super users or anybody that has administrative access onto your system must be enforced to have two-factor authentication. I believe you should have two-factor authentication for all of your financial and senior admin staff as well. It's not difficult to implement. Well, I'd say it's not difficult to implement, but when it comes to staff members and certainly students, there is a barrier to adoption. So you don't want to be blocking students from getting onto the system because you've implemented such an onerous authentication system. I believe that there are other mechanisms in place to protect your students, not sharing outside the domain, restricting their email for only inside the domain. So there's some really good IT policies that could be implemented very simply and very easily that we do. We do it with all of the schools we work with that would limit that exposure. So you could kind of get a balance of both worlds, encourage the adoption, but also ensure security.
Yeah, I guess the way I would think about that one, again, I'm always putting on the teacher hat, is I'm trying to do a lesson and the kid all of a sudden needs to do two-factor authentication. He left his phone in his locker. You know, right there, now we can't proceed. So that one for me would be a little frustrating. And then the question I would ask is, what data does an individual student actually have access to that would be of concern as it pertains to POPI? And it's I would imagine little to none. Because it's not that kind of data. It's their own data, perhaps, but not school or even other learners' data that they really have access to anyway.
Yeah, and you've got systems for you're talking about this balance between being proactive in your security and retroactive, and both have their role and their place. And you don't want to rely just on retroactive because you could not kind of no security in place, but nor do you want to be overly onerous and proactive where people can't log into the system. They can't do the everyday tasks that they want to do, and that's a limitation. So that's on the authentication side of things. Communication, email is again, like there's no one that is more important than the other. You may have been following some of the issues with hacking and malware in the States. I think there was a pipeline that went down in a meatpacking plant. All of those came through the email server. Through the communication side of things. And you know the issues with malware and phishing attacks and kind of all those things that go on. But communication is a critical one. You need to make sure that you are adhering to international best standards. That is a moving target year on year. As quickly as we make it secure, people are trying to pick the system apart. And communication is, and email is a kind of a weak link in that regard. So, you know, I just want to make a note here. I often hear from people, oh, we can implement this third-party system. This one does spamming. We've got Mimecast that will do this. And that creates a false sense of security. Google is an unbelievable system. If set up and the best practices are implemented to the email flow, Google has all of the tool sets that you would require for protecting your system. The third one, any questions on communication?
No.
Give me a gap.
Go for documentation.
Okay, so documentation, and here I'm talking about sort of any information that pertains to your job, where you're collecting information. It could be on your personal computer, it could be on a server. I used to call it the general dumping ground, where staff share, where people would just offload those things that they didn't know what to do with. They would kind of offload that digital material. It can be documents that are sent out via email, printed, downloaded. Obviously, printing you've got the physical parameters, so that's not too much of an issue. But it could be things like school reports, academic reports, disciplinary records, school databases, pupil support records and reports. That's one we often don't speak enough about. I've had a situation where a pupil support teacher was passing some very critical information backwards and forwards, and unfortunately CC'd parents in on it, and that was an issue. I've seen that happen several times. But essentially, those are your three big risk areas. Everything else kind of pales in comparison to those.
And one of the things that we often get questions around is how do we automate the workflows around student reports. So I do think that schools need to give some thoughts to, okay, we were using the Google toolset, we've automated that a bit now, but that is one of those mission critical privacy things that you would think about, a student report in particular, and where those sit. And I think if I were to think of our clients, probably 90% of the schools that we work with are still putting those kinds of things into shared folders. What's a problem with a shared folder?
So I wonder if we can maybe, before we get to shared folders, I think it's probably a good time to do the really nerdy thing and actually look at the law. Kevin is going to chastise me for having a slide with way too many words, but I do think it's appropriate. Yeah, no, one or two, but I do think it's an appropriate point just to have a look at it. So firstly, just to take the standpoint, is Google Workspace, is it POPI compliant? Well, the first thing is that it is GDP compliant. And in fact, if you're looking at a digital service and they say to you, oh, we're POPI compliant, but we're not GDPR compliant, I would take that as a bit of a red flag. You want to look at a service that is both GDP and POPI compliant. So Google Workspace is GDPR compliant. It's also got a whole lot of independent IT industry standard audits that it's fully compliant on as well. And it is POPI compliant. So that's the first maybe tick in Google's box. However, that is just dealing with the technical compliance of the tool set that they have. In fact, the whole stack of GCP is compliant. I'll come back to this slide. The Act itself, and I've kind of sliced out some key parts to it. Section 7 or point number 7, section 19. Again, in our resources, we've mentioned it, but it says here that the responsible party must secure the integrity and confidentiality of personal information in its possession or under its control by taking appropriate, reasonable technical and organizational measures. And so the Act itself has a split around the technical side of things. Think of that as 50% of the job in getting to your POPI compliance. And the other 50% is the organizational measures. So Google is not going to check a box on the organizational measures, how you organize things within your own school. What they can tick a box on is they have the technical resources in place. They're encrypted. They're applying their best practice settings. How it gets worked out is you need to identify risks. You need to establish and maintain appropriate safeguards. You need to regularly verify and continually update. So those are just some of the key words that go into there. So coming back to your question, Kevin, I think was around how do we ensure? Well, from a technical perspective, yes, you can put policies in place, but the more challenging one is how do we get the behavior in place? Hopefully that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So you've answered that question, is Google Workspace POPI compliant? How do we structure things to encourage the right behavioral practices? So there's the technical side. What do we do about the behavioral side?
Okay, so from an email perspective, with good technical policy, you've kind of covered all of your bases. With good authentication policies, you've kind of covered your bases. This one that is out in the wild and a little bit more difficult to control is your documentation and where is that information stored and how you can control it. So it's critical here to point out that Google have kind of two products. One you probably know very well in the audience, and one you may not know as well. And the one is obviously My Drive, which is your personal data that you own and upload, and the other is Google Shared Drive. So Google Shared Drive really is the product that is meant for organizations to be able to control this data. It's different from Google Personal Drive in a couple of different ways. And Kevin, you'll probably see it more practically than I do. And the first is that the data in Google Shared Drives is owned by the organization. It's owned by the school, so to speak. Where the data in my personal drive is owned by the person. So that's a pretty key one. So once you've got that under your control as a school, you can start to implement some more granular details or some more granular controls onto the drive itself. So in Google Drive, you have the ability to change somebody from a view to a commenter to an editor. In Google Shared Drives, you have 5 layers. You have sort of a viewer, what was it again? Commenter.
It's a content manager.
Content manager. Anyway, there are 5 different levels.
There's 5 roles.
That's right. Yeah. So there are like 5 different roles in there. So 1, the data is owned by the school. 2, you have greater granular details in being able to manage what you can, how people can engage with the data. I think that one of them is content adder. So I actually did write it down somewhere.
I've got it coming up in a slide.
Oh, good. So it really is around sitting down as a management and deciding what that structure is going to look like and implementing it.
Okay. And in fact, what we found, so when we do a fresh deployment of Google for a school, we actually switch off, or in the old days, we switched off team drives, we switch off shared drives now, because what we find from a change management perspective is it's too much for people. Like I've got shared folders, I've got my drive, what's this thing called shared drives? And before you know it, people start creating shared drives. And I think we visited a school that said that they had 700-800 shared drives set up, which is not the purpose or the best use of shared drives. So we created a workshop to help kind of schools to manage when they switch on shared drives and be able to do that with a little bit more of a plan and a strategy in mind. And that workshop, if you go to the next slide, covers a few things. One is to try to unpack this distinction between shared drive and my drive, or shared folders that we use typically. We break down what's that member access, what do those roles look like? If I'm a contributor, what can I do? If I'm an editor, what can I do? If I'm a manager or a content manager, what can I do? So those are all different roles. We go into the actual settings of shared drives. And then what I enjoy the most about doing that workshop is we get into the nuts and bolts of how the organization itself structures its own data. And I think that's the challenge that schools are probably facing right now with POPI is, where is stuff? Where are we keeping it? We've got finance stuff, we've got student records, we've got personnel files, we've got all these different systems. Some are paper-based, some are digital, some are a combination of the two. And so what we've done is we've given schools, I walk them through all this information, and then we leave them with this planning tool, which is a rather complicated planning tool. Aleister can testify to that because I made him use it for our own work. But if you want to, it was very handy. If you want to share that last slide, I've kind of got a snapshot of that planning tool. And it basically walks people through the process of what do we need to think about when we're setting up those shared drive settings, who's going to be able to have what roles, and then once we get into the specific shared drives, what folders do we need to have in that shared drive? So we go through a step-by-step process, first of giving people knowledge of how do we think about our data and think about the information and how our organization works together, which is unique for every school. And then there's a very structured process for working through how are we going to organize that information. It is, the workshop's only an hour. The work that follows, though, I'm working with one school now it's taken many, many weeks. So it's not an instantaneous process. But I think when we talk about being POPI compliant and being able to show that you did some work to be POPI compliant, going through this kind of a process is one of the ways to ensure that you have looked at your policies, you've looked at your systems, and you've addressed some of the behavioral issues at the same time.
Yeah. Listen, I think it's fair to say, and we did this as an organization, it unpacked some dirty laundry of things we had just dumped over the years that kind of needed to find a home. And creating a folder called miscellaneous was banned. If I'm not mistaken.
That was banned. But we're now doing. We have a new system in place. We say we have a dev folder, which is
we just renamed the miscellaneous folder.
It's a new dumping ground.
But it was an incredibly potent exercise for us to go through internally.
Yeah, and I have to say it's one of my favorite ones to work with schools on, because it does kind of get into the weeds of how you work together as a staff and how you guys think about your works, get your processes, and it helps schools, I think, take another step forward into that digital world. So we've got we're almost out of time. We've got a couple minutes. I guess, Aleister, in conclusion, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 things that schools should focus on right off the bat? And you can take us to that last little POPI slide.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll leave it at the Q&A for the moment. I'll rather speak to it. The first one is a little bit more on the legal side of things. But when it comes to the collection of data, particularly when it comes to the collection of children's data, there are some very specific mentions in the Act about this, that the person, you have to have the consent of a competent person, whether as a parent of that competent at all times, I would like to second guess that. But essentially, at the end of the day, you need to look at your policies of collecting data. You need to ask for consent. So that could be done through when a contract, when parents arrive at school for the first time, that they sign and say they allow you to utilize the data. It could even be done through or highlighted in an acceptable usage policy that you ask the students to kind of complete. So you need to update, or if you don't have those, you need to implement some sort of policy in there that requires consent.
I saw that recently. We've got a client that's using Google Form for their applications. And that's right up front in the application process, because they're collecting a lot of data right up front when the students are applying. So they have it in that application form.
Yeah, you've got to ask a question like what data is, sorry, I'm probably mixing my language a bit here, but what is the data that is relevant to what you're doing? You know, we as a business, we apply for, I don't know, something out there and trying to engage with another business. And now they want all this documentation. And a lot of that documentation is completely irrelevant to the engagement that I'm having with that business. And I'm like, you don't need that. So you need to look at the relevance of the data that you're collecting. And generally, schools are very good at this. So, but I would make sure from a legal perspective that that's in place. Obviously, make sure you've got a data officer who's appointed. That's a legal requirement anyway. The second part of it is a bit more on the technical side. You need to identify your risks. You need to find out where your gaps and your holes are. That is something we do at CloudEDU. We've built an incredible tool set, which we've called the risk, or what is it? The risk to personal information audit, where we're able to go through REPA, that we go through the domain, and it's an incredible amount of work we've put into that to helping you identify what those risks are. And then once you've identified those risks, is to deal with those issues and to plug the holes if necessary, and implement policies and best practices that are going to assist you. So something like what we call, the technical term is DLP, or data loss protection, where you have phrases in place that can be captured. So if your students are sharing their ID numbers with anybody, that should raise a red flag, whether that's in a document or via email. So it's implementing those best practices, identify that risk, and then make sure you've got stuff in place. And then as we've said, from a central data storage control documentation perspective, that is a task you need to go through. I like the word workshop, which means you're going through the thinking, you're rethinking what you do, you're taking it as an opportunity to be more effective and efficient, but also safeguarding that people who shouldn't have access to certain information don't. And those that do, how do they access it? Can they print it? Can they download it? Can they just add? Can they not delete? These are all critical areas that one needs to look at.
And I'm going to do a quick shameless plug, because this is a free webinar. We for those schools out there who are figuring out how to do this, and if you're not already our client, we have put together kind of a POPI package to try to save schools some money, where it includes that the REPA, that audit that Aleister described. It includes the Shared Drives Best Practices Workshop, and it includes one admin console training called Online Safety and Security for Schools. So if you're interested in that, you can get in touch with either Aleister or I, and I'll drop my email in the chat in a minute. Aleister, we do have some great questions coming in, and I'm going to just try to pose them. Sometimes they're spread over several comments, so be patient with me. But Brian asked about, he said he often gets told that Google is not good with privacy. And this is something that we occasionally hear from people who are afraid of what happens with their data. Can you explain the difference between personal and school accounts in terms of ad
Sure.
tracking across the web and also the display of ads in Google search and that relationship between that and Google Education?
Yeah, so maybe just to split it down the middle and differentiate between consumer accounts and enterprise level accounts. And Google are not the only business that do this. Microsoft, Apple, they all do it themselves. You've kind of got to split. So Gmail, if it ends in @gmail.com, that's a consumer account. The model there for business is that they provide free services for you. In return, they get to advertise. So inside of Gmail itself, you get a column on the right-hand side, or if you're busy searching, you get a column on the right-hand side based on what you're searching, or in what has been interesting for me is what they're hearing. They will advertise those specific topics or those specific things that you happen to be discussing or searching for. What they are not doing, and this is where there's some misinformation, they are not selling your data on. They are using algorithms. They're not looking at your data either. They're using algorithms to identify and do targeted advertising. So that's on the Gmail side of things. Google Workspace, which is exactly where Google Workspace for Education falls, is an enterprise level product, and it doesn't do advertising in it. So there are a certain number of products that Google have within the Google for Education. Gmail is one of them. There is no advertising inside of your Gmail, school-owned Gmail account in any shape or form, nor Drive, nor search. The one that maybe throws up an issue is YouTube, but YouTube is not part of the Google for Education package. It is, in fact, it's a standalone company within inside Google itself. Google Maps is not part of Google for Education. But all of the Google for Education core products are workspace, enterprise level. Your data is incredibly secure. And in fact, Google are very good at that side of things. So they don't look at your documents. The data is owned by you. That is governed by law and also by industry practice.
And you mentioned Google Workspace. We've got different Google Workspace products now. We've got Google Workspace EDU Fundamentals. We've got 3 paid products. Louis asked, would you suggest going Google Education Plus is easier or better to manage Google Classroom and data and its environment than Google Fundamentals, or they're all Workspace?
Yeah, so they're all starting at a very good foundation and a very good base. So all the tool sets around spam, malware, Google Shared Drives is all part of Fundamentals and therefore available in all suite of tools. What the paid versions do is give you additional features. So the teaching and learning upgrade, which can be bought as a sort of a individual teacher level, gives you greater amount of people with inside of Google Meet. It gives you greater functionality with inside Google Meet. It gives you the recording functionality and originality reports. There is one above that, which is called Education Plus. That comes with a whole barrage of enterprise level security tool sets that will make things a lot easier and being able to identify, triage, and also dashboarding potential risks. However, with that said, it really is meant for big schools with big needs and universities. It is that's an enterprise level security feature add-on.
Okay, I think I can answer this one, but I'll pose a question, answer it, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. Richard asked if we only look at risks within the Google domain when we do our security audit, and I'm going to guess the answer is yes. Our focus is a Google partner, is on Google and Google services. What I'll say in terms of the shared drives workshop is it sometimes exposes that there are other aspects in the organization where data may not be managed as carefully as it could be, but our focus is on how to use the Google tool set and specifically your Google domain.
Yeah, and what we do as well is provide solutions for doing things like controlling documentation and data storage.
We've got 2 more questions I want to make sure we cover. Mary had a comment that they've been told that getting generic consent isn't good enough, and that you have to specify each instance of sharing and get permission for each instance. And that apparently comes from a parent who was involved with the act. My guess is it's early days. It doesn't seem like that would be an enforceable. Like there's the law and then there's what's practical. And that, to me, that doesn't sound like it would be an enforceable practical side. But the question was asked in the context of Dylan raising a question around, as the Google admin, they're accepting app permissions on behalf of children under 13. And are they legally allowed to do so on behalf of the parents, or is that something that could be signed off once in an AUP?
So there are some legal questions there. We're kind of going into the deep, dark world of legal. Firstly, I do think there's a distinction needs to be made between signing up for a digital service and an institutional-wide service, as we've got in Google Workspace. So here's a working example. You have a member of staff that does something irresponsible on email. They cannot claim, oh, that's my personal email account. That is a work email account, and you are communicating on a work email account, and the organization exercises its control over that data. The school owns the data, put it that way. You're essentially applying and giving students accounts on your school Google Workspace account. So you're not giving them a random Gmail account. So I do believe that there's some legalities in place there that allow you to get a generic consent for, and you can specifically name that service. That would be a cover-all. Again, I'm not a lawyer, and somebody may have a very different point of view on that. I think Dylan raises a good question around third-party applications. What you don't want is a free-for-all on third-party applications that are connected to your school system in any way. You do want a tightly controlled app environment, and you do want to look at what applications are you allowing your kids to use on your domain. You need to thoroughly investigate. Just clicking a button is not good enough.
Right. And that's all for the questions that we have. I want to thank you, Aleister, for taking the time today to share your expertise. I want to thank everybody who has contributed questions. Thank you. We've had a very interactive audience today. It's always wonderful to see people actually watching and engaging. If you have follow-up questions, you probably know where to find us. I popped my email in the chat, and if you have a question, you can toss it to me, and if I can't answer it, I will forward it to the expert in the room. And I just want to thank everybody, and particularly Aleister for his preparation for today, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. We probably won't be back in 2 weeks because we're sort of entering that end of the term period, and I know people are feeling a little bit hectic. So look for us to return probably late July, early August for some more great webinars. I'll probably post my my teased Gmail webinar soon to fill in the gap. So I want to thank everyone for coming today, and have a great afternoon or evening, depending on what time zone you're watching us from.